everyone, Nurse Wendy. There's a lot to talk about today. We got some new guidance on Friday, and it gave us a new set of metrics, and it asked us to really pay more attention to the screening processes that we're going to use before we decide whether or not to come to work or school. So today I want to talk about all of those things. So the new metrics allow us to look at the transmission rates of COVID in our county in a different way. In the previous metrics, we had to sort of pass the metrics for 3 weeks in a row in order to be good to go to bring students back. Now we're looking at our metrics in 2-week increments, and we're looking back for 2 weeks to figure out what category we are in terms of our metrics. Also, in the previous metrics, depending on where we landed, we had 1 week to implement our programming. Now, it's much easier to communicate with families because once we know where we sit with our metrics, we have 2 weeks to implement. So we'll have more time to communicate. The new metrics are divided into 4 levels: green, yellow, orange, and red. In the green metric zone, our metrics are favorable for us to prioritize bringing students back into buildings, either on-site or in hybrid. So that means that if we have less than 34 cases over a 2-week period looking back, and we are in the green zone, we can start bringing all students back in either on-site or hybrid. If we're in the yellow zone for our new metrics, that means in our area we have between 34 and 67 cases over the last 2 weeks. Then we will prioritize carefully phasing in hybrid for elementary schools, K-3 and then K-6. It's really important for our community to recognize that during that time the middle school and high schools will be in comprehensive distance learning with limited in-person instruction, and we can begin to phase them in once we have shown that we can have the elementary students back in school without generating any community spread. So during these early weeks when we are having K-6 grade students in hybrid in our elementary schools, it's very important that we adhere closely to our public health priorities. In the event that we have 68 to 36 cases looking back for 2 weeks, that would put us in the orange zone. And during that time, we have a wide range of metrics that allows us to communicate with families as we consider transition into comprehensive distance learning with allowable limited in-person instruction. Finally, in the 4th category of the metric, if we had 137 cases or more, then we would be required to go into distance learning. So in addition to the county case count over 14 days, the county test positivity also matters and can put us into green, yellow, orange, or red. So the county test positivity also can impact whether or not students can be in school. Right now, the City Schools is excited because we are in the yellow zone, which allows us to bring in our elementary students. We will be starting grades K-3 on November 5th, Thursday, November 5th. Then the following week, we will include grades 4 to 6, so all grades K-6 will be in school starting November 12th, Thursday, November 12th. I want to talk a little bit about what we as a community can do to ensure that we don't have community spread, because that's how we get our older students back into schools. The new guidance really encourages us to pay attention to screening as we start thinking about bringing people back to school. So I want to talk a little bit about the screening tool that we're going to be using to help you figure out when your students can come to school and to help staff figure out when they can come to work. Here is the tool we would like you to use to determine if your student can go to school. First, look on the left-hand column to figure out what applies for your student. If your student has one of the primary symptoms of COVID, which would be a fever greater than or equal to 100.4, new onset and/or worsening cough, difficulty breathing, new loss of taste or smell, or excessive fatigue or lethargy, or if your student has 2 of the other symptoms associated with COVID, which include sore throat, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, chills, muscle pain, new onset of severe headache, new onset of nasal congestion or runny nose, then your student may not attend school. The expectation at that point would be that your student be evaluated by a healthcare provider and/or be tested for COVID-19. One of the things that's new about this guidance is that during that time, when you have an ill student at home, if you have siblings or household members who also attend school, they may do so as long as you do two things. We monitor them very carefully for symptoms, and if they become symptomatic, you're available to come and bring them home. And as long as you are having an evaluation done of that sick student. When a student is evaluated for COVID-19, there are many ways that the student can return to school. If the student has a negative COVID test, and the student is fever-free for 24 hours, and if there's no diarrhea or vomiting, if those were the symptoms, for 48 hours, and all other symptoms are improving, with documentation of the negative test result, your student can return to school. If your student has another diagnosis that is not respiratory identified as a reason for a fever, and the medical provider writes a note saying that there's an alternative non-respiratory diagnosis, with that note, and when a student is fever-free for 24 hours without using fever-reducing medication, and there are no diarrhea or vomiting for 48 hours, and all other symptoms improving, with that letter from the health provider, the student can return to school. If a student is not evaluated or tested, and there's no alternative diagnosis, the assumption is that that student could be positive for COVID, could have COVID, and should therefore stay home for 10 days after symptom onset. That student cannot return for 10 days and after being fever-free for 24 hours without using fever-reducing medication, and when there is no diarrhea or vomiting for 48 hours and all other symptoms are improving. Now, if a student is positive for COVID or is symptomatic and has been exposed and so is presumptive for COVID, the student may not attend school. If the student tests positive for COVID, or if the student has been exposed to someone with COVID and has symptoms, that student may not attend school. We will work with the family and the health department to determine that that student needs to isolate for 10 days from the start of symptoms. That 10 days is required. Siblings and household members of that student may also not attend school. They will be doing a quarantine established by the health department. So, for the student who has COVID, that student may return after isolation for 10 days after symptom onset, and that student is fever-free for 24 hours without using fever-reducing medication and all other symptoms improving, with a letter from the Klamath County Public Health Department saying that their isolation time is over. If a student is in close contact with someone who is a positive or presumed case of COVID-19, that student may not attend school. We will work with the health department to determine how long that student's quarantine will be from the last contact with the COVID-19 case. When the quarantine time is over, that student can return with a letter from the Klamath County Public Health Department saying that the student is out of quarantine. One of the other things that our new guidance update does is it adopts the new CDC definition for what a close contact is or what exposure is. It used to be that if you were within 6 feet of someone for 15 minutes in a row, that would be considered a close contact. The definition has been made more broad now. If you're within 6 feet for a cumulative total of 15 minutes over time, that is now considered to be a close contact. So you don't need to be sitting near someone for 15 straight minutes in order to be considered a close contact of that person. You just need to be within 6 feet during a period of time breathing their same air cumulatively for 15 minutes.